The high-frequency whine of feedback hitting the studio monitors didn't just pierce the room. It hunted. It was a jagged, relentless spike of sound that vibrated straight through the thick, multi-layered soundproofed walls of the isolation booth and sank directly into the floorboards. The air inside the control room smelled of hot electronics, stale, dark roast espresso, and the sharp tang of the ocean wind bleeding through the seals of the coastal windows. I didn't even need to glance at the digital decibel meter glowing an angry red on my primary mixing console. The rogue frequency was peaking violently at 3 kilohertz. It was pure, unadulterated garbage audio, the kind of amateur mistake that ruined expensive ribbon microphones and blew out studio subwoofers. I let my thumb slide smoothly over the motorized master fader, pulling it down to the floor and killing the noise instantly. The sudden, profound silence that rushed back into my meticulously engineered studio was a physical relief. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, rubbing the bridge of my nose, listening to the muffled, rhythmic drumming of the coastal storm battering the glass behind me. The sound-dampened door to the control room didn't just open, it flew inward, slamming hard against the charcoal-colored acoustic foam paneling. The brass latch squealed in a high-pitched protest against the sudden violence. If that secondary venue isn't secured and acoustically mapped by tonight, the entire charity broadcast is canceled, a woman said. Her voice was tight, echoing sharply against the baffled walls, completely stripped of any polite filter. The primary corporate sponsor will pull their funding immediately, and my independent agency goes bankrupt before Monday morning. I spun my chair around, automatically pasting an unbothered smirk onto my face. It was my default armor, the carefully curated persona I used to handle panicked producers and chaotic artists. I gave her the same half-smile I used on nervous clients, then tightened my hand into a fist until my knuckles popped. The tremor in my fingers disappeared on the next breath. I didn't offer a polite introduction. She stood frozen in the threshold, shivering visibly despite the rain-slicked canvas coat she wore. Her arms were wrapped desperately around a reinforced cardboard box overflowing with coiled XLR cables, steel C-stands, and dented condenser microphones. The bottom corners of the cardboard were turning dark and soggy from the driving rain outside, threatening to give way at any moment and spill $20,000 of fragile electronics onto my pristine floor. Her dark hair was pulled into a chaotic knot, held together by a single plastic pen that looked ready to snap under the tension. A streak of black printer ink smeared across her cheekbone, highlighting the dark circles sitting under her wide eyes. She marched directly toward the custom-built mixing console, her boots leaving wet tracks across the hardwood, and dropped the box onto a stack of empty Pelican cases. The plastic groaned under the weight. "I'm Charlie Foster. I run the independent event coordination agency down in the valley," she breathed, her dark eyes darting from the glowing soundboard to my face. "The Valley Hotel owner, Mr. Vance, sent an automated email this morning at 5 o'clock. He claimed a city inspector would assess his primary ballroom roof sometime next week due to a supposed leak. The charity board expects a fully operational, live-streamed gala from me in exactly 48 hours. Vance knows this production schedule perfectly well. He is deliberately stalling the repairs so the inspector can formally cite me for non-operation, void my security deposit, and officially terminate my vendor contract." I looked past her tense shoulders at the rain-lashed windows. Another gust of wind hit the building, rattling the glass in its frame. "I saw your mobile acoustic rig parked at the hardware store," she added, her knuckles going white on the edge of the damp cardboard box. "I know you're the lead engineer contracted strictly to handle the post-production mix for the broadcast. I know your operation doesn't do high-capacity live event acoustics. But I desperately need your mobile gear and your structural knowledge right now." I leaned my back against the console, crossing my arms over my black t-shirt. If I dragged my sensitive studio equipment out to an unmapped venue for a live charity broadcast, I risked ruining my gear, my mixing schedule, and my industry reputation. County permits didn't care that it was charity. If I moved my rig without authorization, my insurer could void my coverage on the spot. But if that specific gala failed, the local youth shelter down in the valley lost its primary funding for the year. "Show me the acoustic dimensions of your proposed secondary venue," I said, pushing off the console, my boots thudding against the floor. "I need to explicitly map the reverb decay, the equipment grounding lines, and the overall ambient noise floor before I can size an emergency acoustic build." Her grip finally loosened on the box. The breath she'd been trapping in her lungs all morning slipped out in one shaky exhale. The defensive rigidity bled out of her spine. She turned and led me out of the studio, pointing down the wet, windswept street toward the empty coastal bookstore she had secured for the backup location. We pushed through the double glass doors of the bookstore. The space was vast, stripped bare of most of its furniture, leaving only the towering hardwood bookshelves lining the perimeter walls. The high, exposed beam ceiling and the endless rows of hard parallel surfaces created a nightmare of bouncing sound waves. I stood in the exact center of the room and clapped my hands together once. Sharply, the sound shattered against the walls, pinging back and forth in a rapid, metallic flutter echo that took nearly 3 full seconds to decay. It was a chaotic, muddy mess of overlapping frequencies. The main hotel ballroom down in the valley had a specific engineered footprint for the live band and the primary auctioneer podium, Charlie explained, her voice echoing terribly in the empty room. She cringed at the harsh acoustic reflection. Her voice steadied as she focused entirely on the practical mechanics of the problem. If the stage isn't acoustically treated to those exact specs, the entire broadcast mix falls apart instantly. The overhead mics pick up this echo, the live stream feeds back, and we lose the auditory impact required for the donors. I pulled a black marker and a highly sensitive digital acoustic meter from my tool belt. I walked the perimeter, calculating the first reflection points and the low-frequency buildup in the corners. I dragged the toe of my boot across the hardwood floor to draw a stark boundary line near the back wall. We dropped the indoor hotel ballroom concept entirely, I diagnosed instantly. We consolidate the support structure by installing a freestanding acoustic baffle system right here. No drilling into the walls, everything sits on steel base plates and manufacturer-rated clamps. A proper dampening build using mass-loaded vinyl and high-density fiberglass panels scales effectively. It kills the reverb, while Vance is legally forced to answer to the charity board for his breach of contract. We bypass his terrible venue. Charlie watched closely from the center of the room, her anxiety visibly spiking again as I marked up the floor. Vance explicitly told me via certified email not to attempt an unauthorized relocation. He cited a strict clause in the master agreement about unsanctioned venue changes. He'll use it to formally sue me into the ground. Vance is sitting in a dry office, expecting a ruined broadcast so he can initiate a lawsuit based on your failure to deliver. I countered smoothly, looking directly at her across the empty space. The bookstore owner already signed a one-day event rider. I am offering you a venue that will hold the broadcast and sound like $1 million studio. But I dictate the mechanical building method based on the available time, the available soundproofing, and the physical space in this building. She stared at me, silently assessing the certainty in my posture. Fine, Charlie agreed, her voice dropping the panic completely and settling into a firm register. She crossed her arms over her chest, accepting the terms. You dictate the acoustic structure, but how do you rig a commercial sound dampening system in 48 hours without a full crew? The studio currently has hydraulic lifts and a stack of premium acoustic paneling standing by in the loading bay, I explained, pulling my phone from my pocket. I only need my junior tech to cover the primary cuts on the foam. The lifts will absorb the physical volume of the upward weight. I dialed Eli's direct cell number, putting the call on speaker and resting the device securely on a wooden bookshelf so Charlie could hear the perimeter being established. Eli. It's Sebastian, I said the second the line connected, the whine of a table saw bleeding through the speaker. Boss. We are deep in the weeds on the Studio B rebuild. What's the issue? Eli's gruff voice echoed loudly, bouncing off the hard walls. I need you to pull 30 10-foot lengths of the acoustic baffling from the reserve stack, I instructed, my tone dropping into a flat cadence. We are executing an emergency load-bearing acoustic build in the bookstore down the street before the charity broadcast goes under. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The saw spun down into silence. Sebastian, we have a full inspection scheduled tomorrow morning for the new console. I'm not losing my focus because you want to play hero. If we get caught dragging that gear into an untreated building, the insurance company will pull our liability coverage instantly. I pulled the digital policy up on my phone and turned the screen toward the speaker, even though he couldn't see it. My rider explicitly covers off-site emergency stabilization. The interns are covering the cable runs. If that broadcast fails, the youth shelter goes bankrupt. Bring the lifts, the base plates, and the heavy clamps. You've got an hour. Eli let out a sigh that rattled the speaker. You owe me a huge steak dinner for this, boss. Give me 50 minutes. I ended the call, sliding the phone safely away, and looked back across the room at Charlie. The gear is en route. She let out a slow breath. The tight lines around her mouth finally relaxed, the defensive rigidity bleeding out of her spine. She walked slowly across the floorboards. She reached out, her fingers lightly brushing the fabric of my sleeve for half a second before she let go entirely. It was a fleeting, tentative contact, but it grounded the frantic energy in the room. "Thank you, Sebastian," she said, her voice dropping to a quiet register. I stepped away from the bookshelf. I set my tool bag down on the floor, directly between her and the designated staging area. I planted my boots, pointed to the deep line I'd drawn in the dust, and met her eyes. "Stand here. Don't cross the line. I'll manage the lifting." By 8 p.m. that evening, the drafty bookstore had been transformed into a clean, controlled commercial work zone. Eli had arrived grumbling, his jacket soaked through with freezing rain, pushing a cart loaded with raw, acoustic, baffling, and steel C-stands. He silently checked the steel clamps on my gear with a quick nod, ensuring my safety rig was locked. Then we went to work. We built it the exact way my old mentor had drilled into me years ago, redundant, fully grounded, and checked twice. Lifting dense acoustic framing isn't a delicate task. It requires physical leverage and perfect communication. I positioned the steel base plates firmly on the floorboards, carefully measuring the angles to ensure the sound waves would be deflected away from the microphones. I braced my boots, guiding the stiff framing while Eli operated the hand-cranked hydraulic lift. A sharp warning crack sounded from one of the older floor joists beneath us, followed instantly by a violent shift as the load became unbalanced. Eli killed the lift mechanism instinctively, his grip tight, steadying the baffle in midair until the shifting stopped. We didn't speak. We adjusted the critical angle of approach and pulled harder. The night felt too short, but the framing held. I tightened the final bolt on the main acoustic header with a socket wrench, locking the joint permanently. I pulled the digital acoustic meter from my belt, stood in the center of the newly formed acoustic shell, and clapped my hands once. The sound was instantly swallowed by the dense fiberglass panels, completely devoid of any flutter, echo, or harsh reflections. I watched the readout. The frequency response hovered perfectly stable, deadened, and no longer bouncing off the walls. "Structure is locked," I said quietly, unhooking my tool belt. The front door swung open, the rusted hinges squeaking slightly, and Charlie walked back into the space. Her shoulders dropped. She walked directly over to the edge of the newly built acoustic perimeter, carefully navigating the scattered tools. She was carrying two thick-walled ceramic mugs, the steam curling rapidly into the drafty air. She set them down precisely on the corner of my workbench without a single rattle, deliberately placing them well away from my power tools. "Black, no sugar, just like yesterday," Charlie said quietly, taking a slow sip from her mug. "I remember my dad practically lived on the worst diner coffee imaginable when he was running his night shifts. Figured you ran on the same fuel." I stepped down from the staging area and picked up the mug. The hot ceramic provided a grounding physical sensation in the damp room. I took a deep drink. The bitter brew cleared the lingering adrenaline from the shifting floorboards. "Thank you," I said, setting the mug back down carefully. "How is the rest of the event setup progressing?" "The main soundboard is dry under the tarp in the back office. The rented microphones are safe," Charlie replied, leaning her hip tiredly against the solid wooden bookshelf. She watched my hands closely as I picked up my cordless drill to check the battery indicator. "Vance called my cell phone an hour ago and demanded immediate answers about the relocation. He threatened to file a formal legal complaint if I didn't cancel the event. I hung up on him." "You enforced the legal boundaries of your independent contract," I noted, checking the green light on the drill. Charlie set her mug down on a coaster and walked over to the front door. She grasped the solid brass deadbolt lock and slammed it shut with a definitive, metallic clank, physically barring the landlord from entering her space. She walked back to the counter, crossed her arms tightly over her chest, and stared up at the perfectly leveled acoustic panels holding the sound together. I reached out to the portable distribution box I had wired earlier. I deliberately flipped the main power switch. Immediately, the string of industrial overhead lights mounted above the stage illuminated with a warm, steady glow. The quiet, rhythmic click of the relays sounded exactly like a steady heartbeat, perfectly countering the quiet isolation of the coastal night outside. Charlie stared at the glowing lights. Her breathing finally slowed to a natural, even rhythm. I pulled my gloves off and tossed them onto the workbench. "You manage the charity board and the sponsors tomorrow?" I said gently, pointing at the glowing stage. "I manage the acoustics." Charlie let out a slow, shaky breath. A brilliant, totally unguarded smile broke across her tired face. "Okay." I stepped back. maintaining the professional perimeter between us. If you want to rest, take the couch in the back office. Your call. I'm not moving you anywhere. But you require horizontal sleep to function optimally for your walkthrough tomorrow. You're remarkably bossy for a guy who barely spoke 2 full sentences to me when I initially booked the studio time, she noted, picking up her coffee mug. I'm an audio engineer, I corrected smoothly, picking up my drill and packing it securely into my bag. It's literally in my job description to tell chaotic people exactly where to stand safely so they don't ruin the mix. Get some rest. The official sponsor walkthrough the following afternoon was a fast-paced war zone of high society expectations and aggressive legal maneuvering. The primary sponsor, an older executive in a sharp navy suit, stood quietly by the main doorway. His arms were crossed tightly, watching the proceedings with intense scrutiny. The ambient noise of the coastal traffic outside seemed entirely muted inside the newly treated space. Vance, the property landlord from the valley, stood right behind the sponsor, wearing an expensive camel hair coat. He stepped in quickly, trying to physically cut off Charlie before she could speak. I stood solidly near the doorway, arms crossed over my shirt. I didn't raise my voice. I just turned slightly, put my shoulder cleanly between Vance and Charlie, and spoke like I was reading a technical manual. The original hotel ballroom is compromised, and this bookstore is legally unsuited due to severe acoustic limitations, Vance stated flatly, waving a copy of the lease agreement. This constitutes a severe broadcast hazard and a catastrophic breach of our master contract. The original ballroom is irrelevant to the immediate safety of this event, I countered. The acoustic integrity of the primary stage is secured by temporary freestanding baffling. It falls within venue owner permissions and relies strictly on manufacturer-rated clamps and base plates for temporary event operations. The sponsor pulled out his own digital acoustic meter from his breast pocket and checked the reading. The green numbers hovered perfectly in the absolute center stable, entirely deadened, not bouncing a single decibel. He tapped his clipboard thoughtfully. Vance pushed forward again. That is an unauthorized structural alteration. It explicitly violates Section 7 of her standard vendor contract. I want it shut down immediately. The sponsor frowned deeply, looking directly at Charlie. Who authorized this relocation? If this isn't strictly permitted, we pull our entire funding portfolio right now. I need an answer in 10 seconds, or I walk. Charlie stepped forward instantly, putting herself directly in front of the wealthy sponsor, taking the intense heat without a second of hesitation. I did. The master lease explicitly requires immediate mitigating action to prevent catastrophic failure of the broadcast. I emailed Mr. Vance the formal acoustic assessment from a licensed engineer yesterday afternoon. I have the digital read receipts proving he opened the file. The emergency relocation was legally mandated to save the charity's fundraiser. I take full responsibility for the acoustic safety of this event. Vance glared at her. I want this event canceled. I stayed completely still, maintaining the physical block between Vance and Charlie. Mr. Vance, listen to me very carefully, I said. The temporary acoustic staging is mechanically sound. I will not compromise the quality of this charity event. You tell your contracted roofers to fix the main leak at your hotel immediately, and then we can discuss future bookings. Vance actively absorbed the certainty in my tone. He looked at the sponsor, then back to the contract in his hand. The sponsor nodded slowly, satisfied by Charlie's firm handling of the crisis. The sponsor tapped his notebook. The engineer is right. The relocation is officially approved temporarily. I'm issuing a formal written compliance waiver and documenting the landlord's failure to provide a safe venue. The insurance rider is attached. The sponsor rapidly signed the digital waiver and emailed a secure copy to Vance's phone. Vance stormed out without another word. Eli, quietly leaning against the back wall, let out a low whistle. Eli shook his head, a wry grin breaking through his gruff exterior. He walked over and left a roll of premium gaffer tape resting on my workbench like a signature of approval. You owe me a huge steak dinner for this, boss. See you in the studio tomorrow. He offered Charlie a brief nod and walked out, the door closing softly. Charlie let out a massive breath, her hands dropping heavily to her sides. She turned directly to me. Her shoulders dropped. She finally blinked. You dismantled his legal argument, she said, her voice remarkably steady. I just pointed out the basic physics of a failing room. I corrected mildly, picking up my tool belt. The following week settled into a new, unexpected baseline. When I finished my long shifts at the main studio, Exhausted and covered in cable dust, there was often a small, hand-thrown ceramic bowl filled with whatever chaotic, highly spiced meal she had successfully attempted to cook, sitting precisely on my front porch step. It was a silent, practical exchange of care. I would eat the meal in my quiet apartment, the absolute silence of my space, contrasting sharply with the memories of her frantic energy. On a Thursday night, the rhythm shifted dramatically. The coastal storm outside had returned, battering the windows with freezing rain. I was sitting in my living room, reviewing the final mix notes, when a loud, violent grinding noise started echoing directly from the bookstore venue next door. It sounded like heavy metal chewing on metal. I dropped my pen, grabbed my jacket, walked across the wet street, and pushed open the heavy doors. The grinding cut off abruptly. Charlie stood near the center of the room. Her hands were completely coated in a slick, black mechanical grease. She stared back over her shoulder at the commercial generator she had rented to power the complex lighting rig. "The main drive belt is slipping," she said, wiping her forearm across her forehead. "Or, the primary motor is actively dying. I have 3 critical lighting checks to run by Sunday for the broadcast, and the generator keeps stalling out every 10 minutes. I walked past her, reached down, and killed the diesel engine. I crouched down to inspect the steel motor housing located beneath the fuel tank. I grabbed a Phillips head screwdriver and a small wrench from my belt. The main ball bearing on the central drive shaft is shot. I diagnosed after removing the steel cover. The friction is throwing the rubber belt off axis. Grab a clean rag. We're taking the motor unit across the street to my workbench. We unbolted the 50-pound motor unit together, sharing the awkward weight, and carried it carefully through the freezing rain into my studio. I set it down squarely on the thick oak bench. For the next hour, I methodically dismantled the steel housing. I utilized a specialized gear puller to carefully extract the ruined, seized bearing. I packed a pristine replacement bearing with fresh white lithium grease and seated it firmly into place with a rubber mallet. Charlie sat quietly on a sturdy wooden stool near my bench, her legs crossed, watching my hands move with intense precision. She had washed the heavy grease off in my sink, leaving her skin slightly red. The steady sound of the rain hitting the glass provided a calm backdrop. Baffles hold the sound. "Lights just sit above it looking pretty," she joked softly, breaking the silence. I wiped the excess grease off the steel shaft with a blue shop towel, checking the rotation. "Your checklist is scarier than feedback loops. A perfect broadcast mix lasts forever on a hard drive. It's just a different kind of permanence." She smiled, leaning back against the wall. The frantic coordinator was completely gone, replaced by someone who was finally allowing herself to sit still and breathe. The next evening, I brought out the remaining premium scrap acoustic foam from the stage build. Without asking for a specific blueprint, I spent 4 solid hours meticulously measuring, cutting, and routing 3 perfect, structurally sound acoustic isolation boxes for the high-end broadcast microphones. I wanted her event to have a physical foundation that wouldn't ever clip or distort. Exactly 2 days later, the fragile rhythm broke. Vance attempted a final, calculated retaliation. He slipped a manila envelope under the studio door late on a Monday night. It was a formal, mandatory acoustic assessment fee addendum. It explicitly demanded an immediate signature and a non-refundable $2,000 deposit to cover the inspection of my engineering work by his personal contractor, or it would trigger an automatic cancellation of all future hotel partnerships for her agency. That Tuesday evening, I was sitting in my minimalist studio, methodically wrapping a length of XLR cable, when Charlie knocked firmly on the door. I opened it to find her standing on the porch in the cold night air, holding the threatening addendum in one hand and a sleek, dark gray corporate envelope in the other. Her usual chaotic energy was muted, replaced by a heavy stillness. "I got a new contract offer from a corporate broadcast firm up in the city," she said quietly, stepping past me into the warmth. "Is it a big firm?" I asked, wiping my hands on a red shop rag. "Massive," she said, tracing the embossed silver logo on the gray envelope. "A permanent, in-house, salaried senior producer position. Full benefits. Paid time off. They want to buy out my independent agency entirely and absorb my client list." I stopped wiping my hands, tossing the rag onto the workbench. "In-house. That means you wouldn't be running your independent broadcasts out of this town anymore." "Yeah," she breathed out, looking around my sparse studio. "It means I wouldn't have to constantly fight Vance's phantom fees ever again. The salary is high enough that I could easily afford to move to a modern apartment in the city tomorrow." If you take that corporate job, you leave the coast, I stated bluntly, picking up a heavy steel wrench and dropping it onto the metal cart with a loud clang. The sharp echo forced the painful reality into the open air. You leave the chaos behind. Charlie stood there in silence for a long moment. She held the sleek, gray envelope like it was fragile glass, then set it down carefully on the bench beside Vance's addendum without letting them touch. If I sign Vance's coercive fee, he wins, she finally said, her voice gaining strength. If I take this safe corporate job and leave the coast, he still wins the local market. So I'm choosing the only option where I keep my agency and my pride. She didn't just dial the number. She grasped the corporate offer, tore the thick cardstock precisely in half, and dropped the pieces decisively into the metal trash can beside my bench. Then, she reached for her smartphone, unlocked the screen with a rapid swipe. She dialed a saved number, put it on speaker, and set it down firmly on the wood. The line hummed with generic hold music for a brief 2 seconds before it connected. Firm management. This is Sarah. A professional voice chimed through the speaker. Hi, Sarah. This is Charlie Foster, regarding the senior producer offer, Charlie said, looking directly into my eyes, her gaze steady. I'm calling to officially decline the position. I've decided to proudly maintain my independent agency here. Thank you for the opportunity. She hit the red button, ending the call immediately. I don't want to leave the chaos, Sebastian, she said, her voice dropping to a vulnerable register. I want to stay exactly here. I want to keep planning impossible broadcasts on my own terms. I want to keep dropping spicy meals on your porch and hoping you open your door. I don't want you to leave either, I finally admitted, the words feeling rusty but true. My studio is entirely too quiet when you ain't making noise next door. Charlie let out a shaky breath, a brilliant smile breaking across her face. So, what exactly do we do about Vance's ridiculous assessment fee? This invoice goes to the charity board separate from anything between us, I said, ensuring the professional boundary was clear. My invoice puts the cost exactly where it officially belongs on the event insurance policy. If Vance tries to push that fee onto you, we attach the inspector's order and file a formal complaint with the city housing office. Then it becomes a bureaucratic nightmare that he simply cannot win. Charlie laughed, a bright, clear sound that filled the room completely. Tomorrow at noon, the primary sponsor is coming by the venue to finalize the paperwork and do a final walkthrough of the sound, Charlie replied, her eyes searching my face as I stayed by the workbench, keeping my hands visible. I'll be there, I confirmed. At 11:55 the next day, my gear case was already staged by the main console. The primary sponsor stood in the middle of the room, admiring the newly installed acoustic isolation boxes I had built. Charlie walked over to the main mixing board. She reached out and deliberately flicked the heavy switch on the massive rig. The hundreds of LED indicators illuminated perfectly, casting a warm, brilliant glow over the console. I walked over and gently adjusted the small brass nameplate reading "Lead Producer" on her podium until it was straight. The quiet click of the relays hummed outside like a steady heartbeat. The mix is solid, Miss Foster. The compliance audit is officially passed, the sponsor noted, inputting the data into his tablet. The board will be thrilled. Charlie walked over, her hand resting naturally and comfortably near my elbow. This is Sebastian Williams, Charlie announced, her voice carrying clearly across the sunlit room. He is the master engineer who designed this acoustic space, built these mounts, and handled all the structural upgrades for the broadcast. He's the only contractor I trust with my events. I've already issued him a permanent, all-access VIP pass for every event my agency runs. She reached into the pocket of her blazer and pulled out a heavy, professional-grade plastic lanyard. My name was printed clearly on the high-quality badge inside. She slipped it smoothly over my head, settling it against my chest. It was a public acknowledgement of absolute trust. He is the licensed engineer who will be handling all the mounts for the charity moving forward. The sponsor nodded, acknowledging my credentials with a firm handshake. We've seen your studio work. The event is in excellent hands. When the sponsor finally left, Charlie walked over to the wooden bench and pulled a small, pristine white ceramic plate toward her. It held a single slice of a dense dark chocolate tart she had brought from the best bakery in town. She pulled 2 polished silver forks from the drawer. She picked up her laptop, her fingers moving rapidly across the keys. Charlie digitally stapled the sponsor's written waiver directly to Vance's threatening addendum, securely paperclipped my commercial invoice to the back of the packet, and hit send, routing the email directly to the city business office for immediate mediation. Fee officially denied and reported, Charlie stated clearly, looking up from the glowing screen. The caterers load in on Friday morning, and my independent agency is firmly locked in. I took the cold silver fork from her hand, setting it down softly next to the plate. I kept my hands in my pockets and my distance intact. Not because I didn't care, because I did. Outside, the coastal wind kept hunting the thick siding of the building. Inside, the red indicator lights on the mixing console held perfectly, beautifully steady, and so did her hand when her fingers finally found mine. The end. Closing thoughts. Core lesson. Stability isn't said. It's built. Green flag. He fixed the room, then handed her the mic. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.